Welcome to Influencers and Inspires. So glad to have all of you here with us at Shir Hamalot. We are completing this year's series with Dr. Gillian Hayes. Welcome, Dr. Hayes. We're really glad you're here.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's so lovely to be here. I would much rather be with you in person, but in the box works.
In the box works. Just for the record, we are taping this on May 20th. And a lot can change in, 2 or 3 weeks time when this premieres. So I just always like to begin by saying the date that we have taped this. Dr. Hayes is actually a longtime member of our congregation with her 2 children and her husband, and is a professor at the University of California at Irvine. In fact, she has about 17 different titles. I will read them to you, and we are very proud of her and of her work, and really want to get to know her, and I think you'll understand why. First, she holds the Robert A. and Barbara L. Kleiss Professor of Informatics. That is in the School of Education and the School of Medicine, and also of Computer Science. She is the Vice-Provost for Graduate Education and the Dean of the Graduate Division, which means she runs all things graduate studies in a lot of ways. And I just, for fun, took out the org chart of UCI's admin, and she is 3 clicks away from the chancellor position. And so that is a big deal for us. And as I like to say, Shir Hamalot is taking over UCI in the best way possible. We have more professors every year, and of course, very proud of also Dr. Hal Stern, who is the provost and executive vice chancellor of University of California at Irvine. So, Professor Hayes, what is informatics? I remember about 5 or 6 years ago, we were standing getting bagels, and you tried to explain it to me, and I need another explanation because I had some trouble understanding. What are informatics?
You are not alone in that confusion. This is both one of the wonderful things and one of the difficult things about naming your department a non-traditional name, but Irvine is a university that likes to do that quite a bit. Those of you who've been around UCI for a time, you know that. In our department, this means sort of a mix of computing research with a whole bunch of other things. So social sciences, arts, humanities, all kinds of things. For me, I'm actually trained as a computer scientist, but the work that I do is really focused on healthcare, education, thinking about how we can bring underserved voices into the process of designing our technologies. And I think this year is a really good example of we've all seen what happens when we're thrust into this very technological world, and some things work beautifully and some things are really painful. And so a lot of what we study in my department is what is that interface? So sort of thinking about how do we design technologies, how do we build them, how do we use them, how do we live with them, and sometimes live despite them when we have algorithmic problems or the other kinds of biases and challenges that we've also seen a lot this year. So we study the ethics of technologies and all of that kind of stuff. My department is really fascinating because we're in the School of Information and Computer Sciences. So we have, that's also where Hal's primary appointment is. So we have statistics, which is all the data nerds, and we have computer science, which is all the computer nerds, and then we have informatics. So we like to think of ourselves as the sort of human face part of that school. That wasn't enough for me, though. I really like to be out in the world with people, which is why I also have appointments in education and in the School of Medicine as well. So how's that for a very vague response that gives you some rough sketches of it?
It's helpful. Let's draw down a little deeper, because I think I know about the present, but it's also very futuristic oriented. So I was reading about your work with autism. So let's use that as kind of an example of how informatics can be applied to autism.
Yeah, that's a great example. So my dissertation research, I was really inspired by my thesis advisor, who at the time when I was starting my dissertation had 1 child diagnosed with autism. Through the time of my studies, his 2nd child was also diagnosed. And I spent a lot of time trying to understand the pain that families go through when they're dealing with all the records and all the healthcare and behavioral health and school records and all of these different things. They're seeing tons of different specialists, so on and so forth. keeping track of records is something computers are really good at, and is really painful for people. And what we saw when we were looking, now this has been a couple decades ago, but at the time, the sort of electronic records you had available for healthcare or for education, they didn't mix well together. And so behavioral health was a really big challenge for people. So that's what I was really interested in at the time. From there, I sort of branched into thinking about how we can use new technologies to try to help understand and then empower people with autism to actually be able to speak for themselves, to be able to advocate for themselves, and not be so sort of in a permanent childlike position. And that's the thing for me now that I'm really excited about. I think, so often we take people with disabilities, whether it's autistic people, at the other end of the age spectrum, potentially people with dementia, whatever it might be. And sometimes we infantilize, or we, don't allow them to express and be their true selves. And what really excites me about technology is you see something totally different. So we've had, I had a wonderful PhD student named Kate Ringland, who did all this work looking at how autistic kids play in Minecraft, and it being this incredibly social space for them, where, we, for many years, therapists and behaviorists in the autism space have often been like, oh, you really have to work on eye contact, you have to work on in-person play, so on and so forth. And Kate's research really upended all that and showed the beautiful ways in which people can socialize online. The thing that's super cool about that is that fast forward 3 years and look how we're all living, right? My kids' primary way of engaging with the world for the last few years, sorry, it feels like years, last few months.
1 year too, so.
Yeah, has been through playing Roblox or Minecraft with their friends. And so we need to reconceptualize all of these things, whether it's our concepts about disability or it's our concepts about socialization and child development, to think about what could a future state look like in which everyone has access, everyone can advocate for themselves, and technology can be a part of that.
Okay, it's making sense to me now. So take the information in and find a way to organize it in a way that's helpful, and then also draw meaning from that information that's gathered.
Mm-hmm.
I have that right so far?
Yes, that's okay. a big chunk of it. Yes.
Okay. So, and then you mentioned the ethics of the information world, and so it feels like the most unethical place. Aethical, that there's no ethics to social media. In fact, a friend of mine calls it anti-social media. And just curious your take on, can anything be done to bring civility to the world of information? And I'll just add one other thing. I was talking to our confirmation class, and I really believe this. I think it's much, much harder to grow up today than it was in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up. I just think the information that's coming to kids is way more than maybe those young brains can handle. I went outside every summer night until my mom called me in at 9:30 or 10 o'clock. That was my information, was Evergreen Way in Millbrae. I mean, that's what we spent our time doing. And now kids are just bombarded every day with their phones and their screens. So walk us through kind of the current thinking on how to bring ethics to this world.
Yeah, well, you are just wading right into a lot of debates with that, both in the popular press, of course, but also the researchers aren't really sure, to be honest, right? There are people who think that things are really, just that social media is really destroying children and all of these things. I'm not sort of on that negative of the front of it, I will say. There's some really brilliant researchers here at UCI. Candace Odgers is one of them, for those of you who want to get to know someone, who really have been studying the impacts of mobile technologies in particular on adolescents, and sort of see that there's a bit of what we might call a moral panic going on with regard to the technologies. So if you look back in the research, when comic books were first invented, for example, people were really, really concerned that you were no longer going to read long form books, that this was going to destroy children's ability to learn to focus long enough to read a full book. And of course, now what people tell you is anything your child will read, we don't care if it's a soup label, they should read it. It's fine. It will all come. The television, the radio, every time there was a new invention, there was this sort of panic of we're destroying our children. We're turning them into zombies. When I was a kid, there was this whole thing about, you were going to become, way too addicted to television and so on. And so in that sense, we sort of play this out every generation. We don't really see it. The flip side to it is there's some real messaging in the media, whether it comes through your 17 magazine like I got as a kid, or it comes through your social media that you're getting now about body image, about heteronormativity, all of these kinds of things. And of course, right now we're seeing, the rise in anti-Semitic content online, and exposure to those things does have real consequences. So I think, I'm sort of two minds about this. On the one hand, I think we're a little over worried about a lot of our technologies. On the other hand, there's some real evidence that social media sort of destroyed democracy in the last 10 to 20 years, and that needs to be taken very seriously. Thankfully, there are great people researching this area. Now, the question is, will we have the moral will to break up big technical firms, to regulate in the ways that we did auto manufacturers or other things? It's not clear if we have the political will to do those things, but it's definitely the case that people need to think about it. And then the last thing I'll say is, for those of you out there who maybe think you don't look or seem like someone who would be a computer scientist or a designer, these are the folks that I like to reach the most and spend the most time with. Unfortunately, from the time I was in college and a computer scientist and one of 4 women in any of my classes, things don't look really that different today. And that's on those of us that are in more senior positions to fix it, to make it look more appealing to you. But it's also, I hope, on all of you to decide you do want to get in and disrupt this, because what we know is that diversity in product design teams and diversity in software teams makes us less likely to make sort of democracy destroying technologies. So if you're really worried about this, if you're a kid, go in this field. If you're an adult, think about talking to your kid about going into these fields and making those changes, and really shaking up the way that technologies are built. Because right now, quite honestly, they're mostly built by men who went to Stanford and MIT, and we need them to be built by a whole lot of other diverse people.
That's a great segue into the state of higher education, of which you've spent, the last 20 years as a student and a professor. And, had from assistant professor to associate professor to full professor and dean and now vice-provost. UCI, I think, is quite unique. A more diverse public school, I don't know that there is in the country. I'm close, right?
There are some, but we're up there for sure.
Yeah, that's something to be very proud of. More Pell Grant recipients, if I'm not mistaken, at UCI than any other university in the country. That's a really strong statement about the values of diversity and of inclusion, if you will. And it makes for UCI a very special place. I should probably say that my wife is a graduate student, her 3rd year in her PhD program in the School of Social Ecology, which is another thing that took me a year to understand what social ecology was. But it is brilliant, and I love it. So tell me, I think you started this new position a month before COVID or something therein. How has it been the last year working with graduate students and their research and just on campus in general? How have you?
Yeah, it's been a tough time to start this job for sure. I started in September of 2019. So I did have a few months under me before COVID hit. Although you all may remember that at that time, there was a lot of disruption and distress amongst our graduate students around the cost of living, which I think we all feel here in California. And in Santa Cruz, the UC Santa Cruz students were particularly feeling that pressure. So it was a tough fall in terms of protests and so on, rolling right into COVID. And then, of course, all of the racial injustice around the various murders last year. So the grad students have had a really tough time. And I feel a deep responsibility. There's a little over 7,000 of them at UCI, and they're all sort of my babies. And Of course, some of them are my age.
I'm sorry to interrupt. My wife likes to say, got another email from Dr. Hayes. Got another email from Dr. Hayes.
There was a time when I was sending them emails literally every day because the COVID context was changing so much. And, I just really felt like they are going through it. Being a grad student is probably the most stressful time of my personal entire life. And that includes all kinds of, health challenges and having kids and stressful jobs. And still that time period was tough. And I feel that for them. And you mix in, now you're sort of locked at home, trying to do all your work by Zoom. In some cases, we pulled them out of field sites. They might have been in other countries, in other states. We locked them out of their labs for some period of time. It was a really tough time. It was, of course, it was a tough time for everyone in the world, but our students were really suffering. The flip side to that, though, is when I'm really trying to be in a place of gratitude lately, I've never seen anything like what our campus was able to do in terms of pulling together. A lot of that is the wonderful leadership of Howard Gilman and Hal Stern, who you all know. And just a lot of it was just on the ground people being so mission driven. And I, of course, saw this at Shir Hamala as well. I mean, this is the beautiful thing about a mission driven organization is everyone just came together and was like, we're going to make this work. We're going to figure it out. And we did. And to think that we transformed this giant enterprise of tens of thousands of students, all of these employees, everyone went, boom, you work remote now, overnight almost. And we were able to keep COVID rates as low as we were on campus. I'm just so amazed. And I've gotten to meet so many people. I was sort of joking with the head of student health. That's a person I would never have interacted with, right? And there were several weeks in a row where I was talking to him a couple times a week. And I've gotten to know the head of student housing so well. And I've gotten to know all of my colleagues all over campus. And that's very special. And so in terms of thinking about the gratitude coming out of this, I know we're going to have a tough time, of course, but I think we have a foundation now that if any of you are looking for a place to go, either as an undergrad or a grad student, I would definitely bet on UCI. I think the foundation is strong. As you say, Rabbi, we are very unique in the sense that we have never said we're going to either be diverse or excellent. We have always said we will be both. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's very many places that are deeply committed to both. We're incredibly selective. We have brilliant students who win all kinds of awards, and we're 50% first generation students. I mean, that to me alone is just amazing.
It's deeply moving. It's deeply moving. I should have also said my stepson is graduating UCI, I guess in the next week or two, and will be getting his master's degree also from UCI. So he's very excited about that. The state of education just in general, our background, I think, as Jewish people is always been education centric. And we saw that as a way of advancement, not only economically, but socially and all sorts of other very positive ways. Do you see the state of education in our country as bringing in more people so that they can take that next step? UCI, of course, is really exceptional in this area. But as you look along the landscape, are universities really doing that?
Like all things, I'm going to hedge and say it depends. I think there's two things that are happening simultaneously. So on the one hand, you continue to have systematic disinvestment by state and federal entities, in which, the amount of the budget, for example, that the UC gets or that Cal State gets coming from the state is just shrinking constantly. And that has to get made up with tuition, with donor funds, with other kinds of things. And that to me is very sad, because that shows that we have stopped thinking of higher ed as a societal good and started to think about it as an individual good. And you see this in conversations with parents and students where we say, well, you have to go to college, look how much your earning potential is if you go versus if you don't go, and so on. And it switches it to a very individualistic kind of mode. I would like to see a world in which we think again about how valuable it is to have an educated populace. of course I'm biased, I'm in charge of grad education, but I just would love to see everyone who's an undergrad go on to at least get a master's, if not a PhD. You don't have to go in an academic track forever. You don't have to become a lifetime researcher, but knowing how to think critically, knowing how to do that kind of scholarship, to me is very exciting. And I think we need more of it in the world. So that's the big challenge. On the plus side, I do think that universities everywhere have gotten the message. And I think this last year has really shown it's time to think very seriously about inclusion, and that it is not enough to recruit students to our universities. We have to make sure that they can thrive. And the sort of thing I keep hearing repeated all over campus, and in fact, all over the country, is they must do more than survive, they must thrive. And that I really take that to heart. And I think we need to think very seriously about how to do that.
Absolutely. I'm a product of the Cal State system. And when I went to rabbinical school, I was sitting around the table with people from Harvard and Yale and the UCs, and I was very, very intimidated. And then my third year, I won the Faculty Award for Academic Achievement. So I was very proud of myself. And I only share that not to be braggadocious, but rather to just say I really found myself in graduate school.
Mm-hmm.
I think the man I was supposed to be. And undergrad was a good foundation for that. But grad school really, catapults a person in a way I don't think anything else would have for me. And so a very valuable time in my life, to be sure. You've kind of mentioned about, I don't know if you use the word disruptor, but somebody who comes into a system to change it even for the better. And I know higher education is, and the admin of higher education is trying desperately to be more diverse. What's been your experience, particularly in the sciences, as a woman professor, and now moving into the admin side, at the very highest levels? Was that tough? Was that scary? Was it inviting?
It was all of those things. I sort of live my life in a world that is filled with highly educated men. And that's wonderful in many ways, and in other ways can be challenging, right? So I started out my career in consulting at the big fancy consulting firms that is filled with all the Ivy League guys that, have strong feelings about things and get rewarded for that, and learned very quickly what women can get away with and what they can't. And I think that continues to be true today. The question now is, do you continue to sort of play that game and learn to say, I hear myself do it even in this interview, right? Men don't say I think as often as women do. They just say what they think. And women say, well, I think da 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 da. And that's just one example of the sort of vocal tics that women take on to make us more socially acceptable. And I was raised in the South, so there's a whole bunch of other things that go with being a good, proper Southern girl, and learning to wear high heels and say please and thank you, and diminish yourself a little bit when you have conversations. I think that's really challenging for a lot of women. And I think women, there I go again with the I think, younger women, what's exciting that I see in them is they're not quite as willing to do that. They just put themselves there and they take up as much space as they want. And that is wonderful to see. The challenge, of course, is, so this week, for those of you watching this now, 3 weeks ago, we saw something happen in the University of North Carolina, where a flagship university, so this is sort of the Berkeley of North Carolina, it's the Chapel Hill campus, decided to hire a Pulitzer Prize winning, MacArthur Genius Award winning person to become a tenured professor. But she had been one of the folks really closely involved in the 1619 project through the New York Times. And so the North Carolina voters got really involved, and they got really upset with the legislature, and a whole bunch of other things happened. And in the end, UNC Chapel Hill still hired her, but did not give her tenure. And this has created a lot of discussion in higher ed this week, as you might imagine, where people are trying to figure out, where do we sit? What is what is open, what is available, what is not. When we tell people that higher ed is a meritocracy, do we mean it? When we tell people that faculty decide these decisions and so on, and not politicians, do we mean it? Can we stand by our words and those kinds of things? And for me, I've always really believed in academia and believed in that openness. And so I was a little bit fearless, perhaps in places that I should have, if I thought about it, had a little bit more fear in retrospect. That said, I come from a very privileged background in this regard because both my parents have doctorates. My dad was a professor and then dean. So I sort of saw behind the curtain a little bit, and I saw these are just people. You know, those of you that know me, you usually see me in yoga pants with like bagel schmear on my face. And, you know, you don't think of me as Vice-Provost. Same thing I suspect for Hal Stern, right? You think he's this nice guy that you see at Temple. You don't think of him as this powerhouse. And when you see behind the curtain and you see they're really just people, it's much easier to step into those spaces. So the thing I'm trying really hard to do is help, especially our first generation students who haven't seen behind the curtain, to see that we're all just people. And so for those of you who are graduate students in my program, like the Rabbi's wife, you see I send silly emails and I try to reveal a little bit of the goofiness that is the real person. I think that's the difference that really makes it. For our first gen students, they've got to know these are just people and they're people just like you, and you too can be in that position of power, and we need you in that position of power. When I look around the UC, we need a lot more Hispanic people in positions of power. We need a lot more Asian Americans. We need the kind of representation of what our student body looks like to be represented in our leadership. And that only happens if we can get you to come along for the ride.
It's really, that's such a helpful explanation. You talk about a meritocracy, and that is the ideal, but you have to have people in positions who can earn the merit to get into those positions. Yeah. I remember 18 years ago, maybe 17, I don't, but a long time ago, I brought together a group of Jewish professors from UCI, given everything that was happening with what was called the hate wall at the time and so forth. Or just before you came, I don't quite remember, but I learned a lot about the society called academics. And it is a whole society different than the way other societies function. There's a whole culture and a whole, just as you described, how you get tenure, for example. I mean, in a lot of other places, your colleagues don't vote on whether you get promoted or not. But in the academic world, that's how it works. And if I were going to get a PhD, that would be one of the things I would study as a sociologist. I was a soc minor, and I just think the society called the academic world is a fascinating world, and it is a society unto itself.
It is indeed. My father always jokes about it, you know, nobody at Apple is calling up the people at Microsoft and Google and asking them if they should promote people, but this is in fact exactly how we do it in academia.
I'm sure there's some wisdom.
Yeah, it is a funny place, but you know, it's funny that you mentioned that about the wall at the time. That was right when I arrived here. And of course, you know, as Jews, I think we always have moments in our lives that we feel unsafe. That's just sort of a background noise that we all live with. And it becomes louder sometimes than others. And when I first arrived here and there was a lot of unrest on campus, much like the unrest currently, actually, I remember feeling a bit unsafe and thinking, this is Irvine. It's supposed to be the safest city in America. What is going on? And then, you know, to the credit of UCI and to so many wonderful people, the radical shift of having open conversations and developing the Olive Tree Initiative and these other kinds of efforts really focused on talking about peace and talking about tolerance. It was really incredible to see. And I think it's a model for a lot of other places.
I remember meeting with Dr. Drake on more than one occasion in his office, who was the chancellor at the time, who now is the president of the UC Regents. Do I have that right?
I don't know what the official title is, but yeah, he's the president of all the UCs. So he's a big boss.
You could see his trajectory as he changed and as his leadership got deeper into this issue. And it was really just a remarkable maturation, both for the university, for the chancellor, and I think for the whole community. I hope we can continue to maintain that, because I think times are challenging right now, to say the least. Any final thoughts, Dr. Hayes? Anything you wanted to bring up or share with our community?
I think the main thing I would say, especially to anyone who has kids that maybe are in college or going to college soon, there's a lot of fear right now about what's going on in higher ed. The tuition prices are skyrocketing. It's getting harder and harder to get in. We had the Varsity Blues scandal. We have all of these other things. And I would just say, it is still a beautiful place of ideas and learning. And I think as Jews, that's something that we really, really value. So try not to be disheartened. And there are amazing schools, the Cal States, for example, lots of UCs. It's not just Berkeley or nothing. And, I hope that people will continue to remember that there is a space where you can have open conversations, you can learn, you can develop, you can grow up. And that place really is college and graduate school. And if anyone wants to talk about life at UCI, I'm always happy to, as well as I think about half the Jews at UCI or something are Shir Hamalah members. So we do indeed have a big club. And that's in fact how we became members. When I don't know if I ever told you this, when I got here, I just asked around the few Jewish people that I knew that I really liked and asked them all where they went. And they all said the same place. So I didn't even shop or go to services anywhere. I just said, okay, well, that's where we go now. But the connection is strong.
We are certainly glad that you did. And I can't thank you enough. This will end our series for this year, and we'll pick it up again next year. And what a great way to end with hope and with the ability to think about our future, both from the university setting, the Jewish setting, and all together as a community. So thank you, Dr. Hayes, and looking forward to seeing you on Sunday mornings when the school year begins, if not before.
Yes, thank you.